On the morning of June 17th, 1939, a crowd gathered in the Place de la Justice in Versailles, just outside of Paris. Despite the early hour, just before sunrise, people were packed tightly together, some even climbing on lampposts or rooftops to get a better view. Among them were local shopkeepers, factory workers, curious teenagers, and even children, perched on the shoulders of their parents. They had come to witness a moment in history, although most of them didn't know it would be yet. That morning would mark the last public guillotine execution in France, the beheading of Eugene Weidmann, a German-born murderer whose trial and crimes had captivated and horrified the nation. The event was meant to be swift and just, a grim symbol of the power of the French state, but instead it descended into a grotesque spectacle of voyeurism, bloodlust and confusion. In many ways it laid bare the brutal contradictions of public execution in the modern age, and ultimately sealed the fate of the practice in France. To support our channel, please click subscribe. Eugene Weidmann was no political martyr or tragic symbol. He was a cold-blooded killer. Born in Frankfurt in 1908, he had spent time in jail for theft before relocating to France, where he plotted a string of kidnappings and murders designed to extract money from his victims. Between 1937 and 1938, he murdered 6 people, including a dancer, a theatrical agent, and an American tourist named Jean de Coven. His crimes were not just ruthless, but calculated. He lured his victims with false promises of work or opportunity, then killed them, usually with a gun, and buried their bodies in the garden of a rented villa in Saint-Cloud. Weidmann's arrest came after a botched kidnapping attempt, and when police raided his villa, they discovered the shallow graves. He confessed quickly, and his trial became a media sensation. France was still reeling from the political and social unrest of the 1930s, and the case offered the press a mix of sensationalism, horror, and moral outrage. Crowds filled the courtroom to see the handsome killer, who murdered with a strange detachment. The jury, while they found him guilty, and President Albert Lebrun rejected his appeal for clemency. The execution was scheduled for the early hours of June 17th, 1939, public as required by law. By 1939, France stood on the precipice of World War II. It was a modern nation grappling with mass media, cinema, and the rise of fascism just across its borders. Yet it still practiced a form of justice that had barely changed since the French Revolution, public beheading by guillotine. The guillotine had long been seen as a symbol of revolutionary equality, a humane method of execution that ensured swift death for all, regardless of class. But by the 20th century, many in France had begun to question the morality and necessity of conducting executions in front of a crowd. And yet there was a macabre appeal to them. Newspapers advertised the time and place, and some cafes near execution sites stayed open all night to accommodate the surge of spectators. People came not to just grieve or solemnly reflect, but to actually be entertained. That morning in Versailles was no different. A crowd of more than 1,000 people gathered. They laughed, drank, smoked, and jostled for the best view. Vendors sold snacks, some even brought cameras. As the sun began to rise, the guillotine was wheeled into place and assembled by executioner Jules Henri Desfourneaux, who wore a stiff black coat and top hat, the traditional garb of the executioner. Weidmann, calm and expressionless, was led from his cell by guards. He wore a white shirt, trousers, and no shoes. Moments later, with little ceremony, he was placed on the guillotine, his neck secured in the lunette, and the blade fell. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in cheers, applause, and raucous laughter. Some surged forward, trying to collect souvenirs, a bloodied handkerchief, a piece of straw stained red. Others took photographs, including one now infamous image captured by a spectator with a press camera showing Weidmann's severed head just moments after the blade fell. Desfourneaux was horrified by what he saw, not the execution itself, but the carnival atmosphere that followed. Journalists wrote scathing reports about how the crowd had behaved like animals, cheering at death as if they were at a football match. One writer described it as a grotesque celebration of blood, while another lamented, "This is not justice, it is barbarism." The backlash was swift. The French government, deeply embarrassed, recognised that the public display had undermined the dignity of the justice system. President Lebrun issued a decree within weeks. From that point forward, all executions in France would be conducted in private, behind prison walls. There are several reasons why the execution of Eugene Weidmann is remembered not just as the last public execution in France, but as one of the most ghastly and shameful. Firstly, there's the crowd's behaviour. The crowd's gleeful reaction was more reminiscent of a medieval festival than a sober act of state justice. Public executions had long been justified as a deterrent, but in practice they attracted the morbidly curious and desensitised the masses to violence. Secondly, there was a media frenzy. Newspapers fanned the flames of spectacle, treating Weidmann's death like a blockbuster event. The presence of photographers, especially one who managed to capture the moment after decapitation, turned the execution into a visual commodity. This image was later banned, but it had already been circulated widely. Thirdly, there was a conflict between justice and entertainment. What was supposed to be a solemn punishment turned into a public entertainment, calling into question the morality of using execution as theatre. Instead of being a lesson in justice, it actually became a grotesque form of public amusement. There was also the timing. The year 1939 was a time of immense political tension in Europe. With war looming, many were beginning to re-evaluate the role of state power and violence. Against this backdrop, the archaic nature of public execution seemed glaringly out of step with the modern age. France never again held a public execution. From 1939 until the death penalty was abolished in 1981, all executions were carried out in private, typically in the early hours within prison courtyards. The guillotine itself remained in use for over 40 more years, until the last execution, that of Hamida Jandoubi in 1977. But the shadow of Weidmann's execution loomed large. It was cited repeatedly in debates about the death penalty, particularly as a case study in how public punishment could warp society's sense of justice. The philosopher Albert Camus, a critic of capital punishment, used such events to argue that the state should never mirror the violence it seeks to condemn. In the end, the last public guillotine execution in France wasn't terrible because of the man who was executed. Eugene Weidmann was guilty beyond doubt. It was terrible because it revealed something uncomfortable about the spectators, the society itself. Instead of confronting the brutal reality of state-sanctioned death, the crowd had turned it into a morning's entertainment. The state had hoped to demonstrate order and justice. Instead, it showed chaos, cruelty, and a thirst for blood. The execution of Eugene Weidmann marked more than just the end of public beheadings in France. It was a cultural turning point. It forced the French public and government to reconsider the morality of spectacle, the dignity of justice, and the psychological toll of state violence. While France would continue to use the guillotine for decades, it would do so behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the crowd. That execution that day in Versailles stands as a haunting reminder. Justice carried out without humanity can quickly become performance in barbarity. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please click subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.